these in front of you here?
Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives this afternoon. Whether you're here in the theater or watching us on YouTube, I'm pleased you could join us for today's discussion of the book Hue, 1968, The Turning Point of the American War in Vietnam, with author Mark Bowden. Our moderator today is Scott Stossel. Before we get started, I want to tell you about a few other programs coming up here in the McGowan Theater. This Thursday, September 14th at 7, we welcome a panel of experts who will explore the historical and modern importance of the Constitution to American society, with an emphasis on America's changing demographic landscape. This is our 11th annual State of the Constitution panel. The New American Constitution will be moderated by C. Douglas Smith, Vice President of James Madison Montpelier. And on Tuesday, September 19th at 7, we proudly present The Words That Built America, an unabridged reading of the authentic words of our founding fathers. The film is narrated by Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David McCullough. Joining us to introduce the film will be director-producer Alexandra Pelosi, who brought together more than 100 readers, including all the living presidents and vice presidents, as well as Supreme Court justices, leaders of the Senate and House of Representatives, celebrities, media figures, and young people to read these iconic documents, and probably her mother, too. And mark your calendars for October 17th at 7 p.m. when we'll be hosting our next Vietnam-related program. Journalist and author Cokie Roberts will moderate a discussion with Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, directors of the PBS documentary The Vietnam War. This can't-miss event is one in a series of public discussions, book lectures, films, and other programs to be presented in conjunction with the upcoming exhibit Remembering Vietnam, which opens in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery on November 10th. The exhibit is a media-rich exploration of the Vietnam War, including interviews with Americans and Vietnamese veterans and civilians with first-hand experience of the war's events, as well as historic analysis. It's a fascinating collection of newly discovered and iconic original documents, images, film footage, and artifacts that illuminate 12 critical episodes in the war that divided the populations of both the United States and Vietnam. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events online at archives.gov. There are printed copies upstairs in the lobby, where you'll also find brochures about other National Archives activities and programs, and a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by email. Today, award-winning author and journalist Mark Bowden shares the riveting history of the biggest and bloodiest battle of the Vietnam War in Hue, 1968. In January 1968, the fighting in Vietnam was at a stalemate. With the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese planned to win the war in a single stroke with military actions and popular uprisings across South Vietnam. But the most crucial part of the plan was the capture of Hue, the country's cultural capital. To date, Hue 1968 has received high acclaim. George F. Will writes in the Washington Post a magnificent and meticulous history which tells with excruciating detail a story that is both inspiring and infuriating. Bowden's interviews, almost half a century on, with those who fought on both sides have produced unexampled descriptions of small unit combat. And in the Wall Street Journal, Karl Marlantz calls it an extraordinary feat of journalism. Through his scrupulous day-by-day reconstruction of this battle, Bowden encapsulates the essential lessons of the Vietnam War. The book is full of emotion and color. The National Archives at College Park and the Lyndon B. Johnson Library are two research facilities that Mark Bowden used to tell the story of the Tet Offensive. Bowden kindly thanked archivist Tim Nenninger and John Wilson for their assistance, turning what would have been a random process into something very directed and efficient. Nice quote about my staff. Thanks. Here at the National Archives, we proudly preserve the permanent records of the federal government and make them accessible to researchers who can then tell the stories of American men and women who contributed to our nation's history. Mark Bowden, author of Hue, has written 13 books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Black Hawk Down, which has sold more than 4 million copies. Mark reported at the Philadelphia Inquirer for 20 years and now writes for The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, and other magazines. He's also the writer-in-residence at the University of Delaware. Scott Stossel, our moderator for today's discussion, is the editor of The Atlantic magazine and the author of the award-winning Sarge, The Life and Times of Sergeant Shriver, and the New York Times bestseller, My Age of Anxiety, Fear, Hope, Dread, and the Search for Peace of Mind, which was nominated for the 2015 Wellcome Prize Award. His articles have appeared in a wide variety of publications, including The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The New Republic, The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, you name it. And his work has been included in the Best American Political Writing. After graduating from Harvard, Scott joined the staff of The Atlantic in 1992, helping launch what was then called The Atlantic Online. In 1996, he moved to the American Prospect magazine, where over the course of 7 years, he served as managing editor. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Bowden and moderator Scott Stossel.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled that you all have joined us on a sunny afternoon to be in here to talk to Mark Bowden. I'm thrilled to be here with Mark. And I want to jump right in. Mark and I have known each other for a long time and worked on a lot of pieces, so I've talked to him a lot about this book. And we were talking not so long ago, and I'm curious about, well, I was curious about what prompted you to write this book. And you, in one of our conversations, mentioned back when you were about 15 years old, in the late 60s, early 70s maybe, you were debating with your dad about Vietnam. And
right.
that this somehow led indirectly, or maybe directly, to this book. So talk about that.
Well, it led kind of indirectly. You know, I'm always on the lookout for a good story, and this is a great story. And you know, I've been interested in the war in Vietnam, as most of us who are old enough to remember it are. It touched all of our lives in one way or another. In my case, you know, my dad was a staunch patriot and a supporter of the war, and I was a arrogant 14, 15-year-old kid who thought he knew everything. And we would have these knockdown, drag-out arguments over the war, and I was against it, and he was in favor of it. And as I've said, I don't think either of us knew enough, frankly, to have a well-informed opinion, but we had strong opinions anyway. And he would always say to me, how do you know that? Or where did you read that? Or why do you believe that? And those were good questions, you know, and I think that those were things that they started me reading newspapers. I subscribed to Time magazine, and I used to read it cover to cover. I started looking for books about Southeast Asia at the library, and I think that was really kind of the first research project that I ever undertook. And so, you know, when this story was suggested to me, and initially I said I really didn't want to write another book about a battle. I'd already done one. The idea grew on me, and it grew on me for that reason, that the more I learned about the Battle of Hue, the more I understood that it was a very significant event, and also, as I said, just a fascinating story. But then secondly, it connected with me personally. It gave me a chance to really begin researching and reporting and investigating for myself the war in Vietnam and ultimately how I felt about it.
So I guess a series of connected questions. Why at this stage, 2017, the book's coming out, why Hue? Or no, sorry, actually first, why Vietnam? Mm-hmm. Why Hue in particular? And set up the context of Hue, why this battle, one among many, many over the course of the Vietnam War,
right.
Was the one that you settled on as the one that you needed to write about?
Well, I can't take complete credit for the idea. It's my editor and publisher, Morgan Entricken, who had been trying to talk me into doing it for a while. And the more I looked into it, the more I appreciated that it was a good idea. I've already talked about the importance of the war in Vietnam. And, you know, the Tet Offensive is clearly, you know, one of the pivotal moments in the war in Vietnam, if not the pivotal moment. It was in the sense of, I think, changing the debate in this country from whether we could win the war, how to win the war, into one about how to get out of the war.
Yep.
Within weeks after the battle, Lyndon Johnson decided not to seek re-election for a second term. Some months later, Richard Nixon was elected, promising to end the war. That's a different promise than we're going to win the war. So historians can argue about, you know, whether this is a significant enough of a pivotal moment. But what was inarguable to me was the scope and intensity of this battle. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized it was far and away the biggest, bloodiest battle of the war, and I felt had been kind of neglected in most histories of the war for a number of reasons, which I can explain later. But I thought what happened in Hue, both to the Americans who fought there and to the Vietnamese who fought there and to the Vietnamese civilians who were kind of trapped in this battle, it was just worth getting this story down. You know,
and well, explain now, why was this battle in particular neglected?
Well, I think in large part because the Tet Offensive took place all through South Vietnam. Attacks were launched simultaneously, or very nearly so, on just about every city and town in the South. Most press was in Saigon, and so most of the coverage of the Tet Offensive was centered around the very dramatic raid that a Viet Cong squad made on the U.S. Embassy grounds there, and there were a number of them killed. So the coverage of the Tet Offensive tended to focus on what had happened in Saigon, and that was, I think, one of the reasons why General Westmoreland, who was not eager to advertise the extent of the deception involved prior to the Tet Offensive and the extent to which it had succeeded, was glad to emphasize the scenario that we saw in Saigon, that it was a relatively small group of enemy who had, you know, made kind of suicide attacks and were quickly defeated. This was not the case in Hue. And even though I discovered there were reporters who got to Hue and who wrote, I think, extremely good stories about it and accurate ones, the overall perception of the Tet Offensive, I think even to this day, focuses more on what we saw happening in Saigon than the major centerpiece of the Tet Offensive, which was clearly Hue.
And is that just because the bulk of the journalism was, or journalists were concentrated in Saigon at that point, or?
Yeah, because, and I think, you know, it was true then, just as it's true today, the attention of the world is focused on a particular place and a particular event for a couple of days, and then it moves on. So by the time the press kind of caught up to the significance of Hue, I think a lot of the world's attention had sort of moved on from the Tet Offensive, which is not to say that Hue wasn't covered. It was, but I don't think the battle itself, the extent of it, was fully conveyed, other than to the military itself. Certainly the Marine Corps has always understood the significance of the Battle of Hue. And there were 2 other books written about this, actually 3, all of them sort of for a kind of a narrow military readership. And I just felt that a couple of things, that the way I would do it would be different. And also, given the amount of time that's gone by, I would be able to do the reporting in Vietnam. So I would be able to tell the story of this battle through both sides, which had never happened before. So for all those reasons, it just struck me as a really good thing to do.
And actually, I'll pause here and say, any of you who have not read the book, is absolutely fantastic and sort of a kaleidoscopic view of the Battle of Hue in the spirit of the best writing on Vietnam. Neil Patrick Sheehan on Bright and Shining Lie, Francis Fitzgerald. But let me ask you an impossible question, which is to, in 5 minutes or less, encapsulate the Battle of Hue.
Well, you can either do that or we can wait for Ken Burns' series.
Yeah.
And I think it'll probably take about maybe 10 minutes of one of his episodes. The Battle of Hue was actually 3 battles. First and foremost, it involved the enemy, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, taking the city of Hue. And they took the city of Hue, which is the 3rd largest city in South Vietnam, and the ancient capital of a united Vietnam, and a city of tremendous cultural significance in that country. They took it in a matter of hours, with the exception of a small American outpost or compound in the southern half of the city, and a South Vietnamese army outpost inside what's the citadel, the big fortress, which is the northern part of the city.
And talk a little about, just pause, the significance of Hue in Vietnam's history and culture and imperial history, kind of.
Well, it was the seat of the Nguyen dynasty, which ruled through the 19th century and up into the 20th century. And it had been, even before then, a major center for the imperial Vietnam, although I don't think it became the seat until early in the 1800s. And they built in the early 1800s this enormous fortress. If you've watched Game of Thrones, it really is something that belongs in the Game of Thrones. It's 30-foot high stone walls, 30 feet thick, with 9 gates, with towers over every gate, with guards and a moat all the way around it. When you see it, it really does look like something that is sort of misplaced in time. That is the northern half of the city of Hue. South of the Hoang River, or the Perfume River, as the Americans called it, was the more modern city of Hue. And that, I would say at the time, probably in 1968, roughly half of the citizens of Hue lived inside the citadel, the fortress, and half lived in this more modern section of the city to the south. Once the city was taken, it took nearly a month for American and South Vietnamese forces to take the city back. And that fighting took place in really 3 phases, really. The first phase was taking back the modern half of the city to the south. The second phase was to take back the citadel, which, if you can imagine fighting inside of this gigantic fortress, how intense that battle was. And then the third was fought by the U.S. Army, by the 1st Cavalry, which was tasked with marching down from Camp Evans, or PK-17, which was a ARVN outpost, and essentially moving down to the outside walls of Hue on the western side to cut off supplies and avenue of retreat for the enemy, which turned into a much bigger battle than anyone ever thought. So, as I said, it took about a month before the city was finally taken, and the city, I would say...
Taken by the Americans in the South.
Taken back, rather, yeah, by the Americans and South Vietnamese. And in doing so, they destroyed about 80% of the city. roughly 80% of the residents of Hue were homeless after this battle. So it was a classic case of destroying the town in order to save it.
This is another big question, but how did you approach your reporting for this piece, this piece? I'm a magazine editor, and for this book. As I say, it's kaleidoscopic, and you've got, you're inhabiting the perspective of American GIs, North Vietnamese generals, South Vietnamese strategists, people in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
How did you go about doing this, and who are some of your favorite characters that you, there's no main character here.
No, and in fact, that was a big decision early on. You begin by reading everything you can find about it, which also gives you a sense of how far our understanding of what happened is gone. And then I just began interviewing people literally at random. Fortunately, because of the internet, the units who fought in Vietnam have reconnected, and you can find their websites, and those are extremely useful for me in locating people. And I always ask people after I interview them, usually for 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes I'll call them back the next day and we'll talk more. But I always at the end say, who else should I talk to? And you end up then with lists and lists of people. And at a certain point, you begin to develop your own I call it a mosaic understanding of the battle. And of course, I traveled to Vietnam, and that's another piece of the reporting, and that was a challenge, and found people who had lived through this experience there or who had fought. And then I go to the archives, in College Park, and to the Lyndon Johnson Library at the University of Texas, and look through with William Westmoreland's papers and the National Security Council papers to find out what was happening in Washington during this time. And of course, at the archives here, there are all the official records of all the units involved. So that's kind of what I call this a top-down understanding, and I've done all this reporting from the bottom up. And at a certain point, it all starts to come together in your mind. But one of the key decisions, clearly, in writing a story of this complexity is that I'm not writing a book that has 3 or 4 or 5 main characters.
Yep.
I'm writing a book about a battle. And the characters, the people who experience this, come and go, throughout the book, which is a little confusing for readers, but I think my goal was to anchor the reader in the narrative of the battle itself. And the fact that the soldiers and Marines and Viet Cong come and go it's true. I mean, most of the guys that I interviewed about this battle were carried off of the field, most of them. And they were wounded at some point and carried away, and their battle ended at that point. So it reflects the reality of it and the scope, I think, of this battle, where you've literally got tens of thousands of people caught up in it. I think the only way to convey the magnitude of the experience is by the extraordinary variety of experiences that people had during the battle, whether they were fighting or whether they were trapped as civilians. So you give up certain things by not choosing 5 or 6 main characters, but I think what you gain is, in my judgment, better. You get a better understanding of the overall story.
And what a great triumph of the book is that you succeed in that and capturing multiple points of view and characters from all sides and all levels of the battle. But did you, on the other hand, the simpler and the sort of natural narrative approach to writing something like this is to find a hero and a bad guy, or 5 heroes and 5 bad guys.
Yeah.
Were you tempted by that, and who were the heroes and the bad guys?
Well, I mean, I certainly don't believe the world is built in a way where there are
Yeah.
heroes and bad guys. I mean, there's certainly heroic people, and there are people who
On
do
both sides.
terrible things. But I did have certain characters who emerged, and I think in part because they were there, for most of the fighting. One of my favorite characters was Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Cheatham, who endeared himself to me, reading about him and listening to his. I didn't get a chance to meet him. He died when I was working on the book, but he gave several oral histories to the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico. And Ernie, as I say, endeared himself to me because when he was ordered to move into Hue, or rather his demand to be sent to Hue was granted, he spent the whole night before he got there hunting up Marine Corps manuals about how to fight in a city, how to assault a fortified position. So here was a man who began his mission, he took his assignment with the assumption that he didn't know what he needed to know. And he took it on himself to literally took a cram course in how do you do this, what I've been ordered to do, and assembled the kind of weapons back at Phu Bai that he thought would be useful and proved to be extremely useful in Hue. So, you know, if I'm going into battle, I want to go with Ernie, you know.
Yeah.
You know, contrasting with that, you have William Westmoreland, who doesn't come off that great in this story, and I think, you know, his story is told mostly through his own words. But here you have a man whose theory of the battlefield, of the war in Vietnam, was so deeply held that, number one, he didn't believe it was possible for the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong to amass an attack like that on the city of Hue. And I think that disbelief helped to enable it, in part. And I also think that, you know, this is a man who, unlike Ernie Cheatham, who begins with the assumption he doesn't know anything, Westmoreland was so convinced that he was right that when the city of Hue was taken, he refused to believe it had happened. And in his cables to Washington, to the Joint Chiefs and to the President, and in his statements publicly, he essentially said, you know, there are just a few hundred enemy troops in the city of Hue, and they'll quickly be, you know, routed. I have a passage in the book where, over a period of about 4 weeks, he makes statements, like a series of like 7 statements saying, in 2 or 3 days, tomorrow, it'll be totally cleared out. And if this goes on for week after week, the consequence of that misperception wasn't just to mislead the White House and the American public, but it led to a lot of young Americans being killed. Because if the assumption is that the enemy is there in fairly small numbers, they were sending small units of Marines, small units of troopers up against overwhelmingly superior forces, well entrenched. And as a result, a lot of young Americans got killed.
And was that delusion on the part, or just denial of the fact they didn't believe that the enemy was so well entrenched, or that they thought they simply couldn't? The plan was the plan, and they were going to stick with it no matter what. Like, what was the?
No, because there? I mean, I don't think they had planned to try to take the city of Hue back, because they had never expected the city to be taken.
Yeah.
But I do think it was a refusal to face facts. If you have General Westmoreland saying to the president that there are like 500 enemy troops in the city of Hue, 2 days after he gets a CIA report which explains that the entire city has been taken, days after his field commander.
So we're not talking about 500 troops.
No, we're talking about 20 times that many.
Yeah.
And he's getting reports from field commanders who are getting cut to shreds from Hue, saying, look, you know, this, we're facing, you know, and in some cases, I think intelligent company commanders saying, no, I'm not taking my men out to assault this fortress and getting them all killed, and then being accused of cowardice and timidity. To me, there was a kind of a willful blindness, which I think is rooted in arrogance and racism. You know, I think a lot of that, and that says a lot about the war in Vietnam. I think that the idea that the troops from this third-rate little pissant country, as Lyndon Johnson called it, could somehow, you know, fool the United States military to the extent that they did and fight with the skill that they fought was something that they weren't prepared to believe.
You spent many years researching and writing this book. What preconceived notions did you come in with that were kind of blown up by the reporting and by what you learned? Are there things that you changed your mind about regarding either Hue in particular or the Vietnam War in general?
Well, yeah, I certainly gained a much deeper appreciation and understanding for the sacrifices of American forces who fought in Hue, certainly, and as a result in Vietnam. I think the intensity of this battle and the things demanded of these young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, are just hard to believe. And the fact that they kept coming back day after day, risking their lives, knowing the chances of their...
Did they have any choice?
Yeah, I think people always do have something of a choice. I mean, you suffer for the choices that you make, and there were guys who you know, who would try to get wounded, or there were guys who would try to do whatever they could to get off of the firing line, but I think that was rare. I think in most cases, I think one alternative, frankly, in a situation that intense and terrifying is to curl yourself up in a ball and just refuse to move. And there are guys who did that, and 18 years old, suddenly thrust in the middle of this maelstrom. I can understand that. I frankly understand that better than I understand the guys who get up and run across the street into enemy fire day after day after day, seeing what's happening, to those around them. So that, my appreciation for them deepened, and also, my understanding of the idealism and loyalty, patriotism of these guys who believed they were doing the right thing by serving their country, by fighting in Vietnam. And in a way, I look upon the whole war now as a betrayal of that youthful idealism, because you read of leaders in Washington who had already reached the conclusion that they weren't going to be successful in this war, and yet they were continuing to send troops over there to fight it. So that changed. I think, my perception of General Westmoreland, I mean, I'm a fairly normal, middle-class Catholic white boy who sort of believes in institutions and tradition. And so I guess my assumption was, well, if General Westmoreland was the supreme commander, he must have been a really smart guy, and he must have really known what he was doing. And I'm no military expert, but I know quite a bit now about the Battle of Hue, and it astonishes me, his level of denial of what was going on there and the consequences of it. That really was
Did that shake your view of institutions? I mean, Westmoreland is not himself the institution, but
I think age is shaking my. When you're 20, everybody in a position of authority is older and wiser than you. But when you're 66, a lot of them are younger than you, and you start looking at them differently. But yeah, I mean it's part of growing up. I think you sour a little bit on your faith in institutions.
So to put your highfalutin interpretive hat on for a moment, what was based on your reporting and the time you spent talking to all these folks, and stepping back from the very vivid reporting you have of the events on the ground, what was the significance and the meaning of Hue? And is there, I guess, a second question? So it's two questions. One is what's the meaning of Hue in the context of American history, and second, what's the contemporary salience, if any, as we send more troops to Afghanistan, as we deal with challenges around the world?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, historians can argue about how important Hue was in the larger scheme of the war in Vietnam, and I try to be careful not to set myself up as an expert on the war in Vietnam. I do know quite a lot about this one thing. My preferred method of writing about things is to find a very powerful story, a good story to tell. And I feel, and this is true of my book Black Hawk Down as well, the book Black Hawk Down is really about the U.S. intervention in Somalia from 1992 to early 1994. But if I had called it that, I think 5 people would have read it. But the way that book is written is that you take that 2-day or 18-hour-long battle, and if you dig deeply enough, it works as kind of a lens on the larger experience. You see all the factors and kinds of people at play in this microcosm that I think give you a deeper understanding of the war at large. And I don't know of too many set pieces like Hue. There are others, but this was, I think, and I didn't really know this going into it, but I believe it now, was a particularly good lens on the war in Vietnam, because it involved so many people, because it involved the North Vietnamese army, it involved Viet Cong, it involved thousands and thousands of civilians, army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, every element of the war, including the politics of the war and the politics in Washington. You see all of this come into play in this one battle. So to me, that's the significance of the book. Mm-hmm. The event itself was obviously, of tremendous and lasting significance to everyone who was there, who took part in it. And there's, that alone, I think, justifies our interest in it, given the number of people who were there. That's, what I try to accomplish with the book, and, a lot of other people try to assess whether it's, important enough.
As I say, the scope of your reporting is extremely broad and ambitious. And I was just flipping through here to I don't know what chapter we're in here, but in previous pieces we've worked on together, you've talked about a mentor of yours, Gene Roberts, who you worked with, I think, at the
Philadelphia Inquirer.
Yep. And I'm reading along, and I get to just chapter IR-8 Rice, and it says Gene Roberts had been in Vietnam for just a month, and I wrote, "That Gene Roberts?" Thinking it can't be.
Yeah.
But it was.
It was, and it
So
was
talk
a
about
total
that.
surprise to me. I had begun working on this book for all the reasons that I've explained, and about 5 years ago I ran into Gene. Gene Roberts is the former editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. He hired me in 1979, and it was, to this day, the most significant event in my career, getting hired by the Inquirer. And he was someone who I learned from for many years and greatly admired as an editor. And I'd kind of known that in his day he'd been a pretty good reporter too, but I didn't really know, other than he wrote a book about his work during the civil rights movement called The Race Beat, which won a Pulitzer Prize several years ago, which revealed to me the things he did during the civil rights movement. And I had known that he had been in Vietnam for the New York Times. So I ran into him in New York, and he said, Mark, what are you working on? And I said, I'm getting started on a book about the Battle of Hue. And he said, I was there. And I said, really? And so, well, we need to talk. And so I flew down to Bath, North Carolina, where he now lives, and we spent 2 days, and he pulled out all his old scrapbooks, and there he was, the first reporter on the scene in Hue after the city was taken. And more significantly, at the same time that William Westmoreland was saying there are like 500 enemy troops in the city who will be quickly defeated, Gene, in a matter of about 3 hours on the ground in the city, and I've been a reporter in this kind of situation, so believe me, I can appreciate what an accomplishment this was, but he ascertained within hours that this city was completely taken by the enemy, that the Marines and the Army soldiers who were there were surrounded in this small outpost, and that the situation was really extreme. That story he managed to get out. In those days, there were no satellite phones and things like that, but he had to fly back up to Da Nang, and he had to get his copy to Saigon, and had to be routed back to New York. But it ran, I guess, 3 days after the city was taken on the front page of the New York Times, which was the first really truthful account of what had happened. And so he was in and out of Hue several times during the battle and wrote amazing stories that were very accurate and were also full of color from the battle. Gene had a wonderful eye for the stray detail. The duck that wandered into the compound that everybody's eyeing hungrily.
It's always about the duck.
It's always about the duck. But anyway, I had such. I was delighted to see how good it was, and then given its importance, I think, to the overall story of the book, and given Gene's importance to me, I ended up dedicating the book to Gene.
So the reporting that Gene did, among other of the famous reporters who covered Vietnam, contributed to the opening of what we didn't before that point, but have since known as the credibility gap.
Right.
And we actually have a piece in the current issue of The Atlantic by Ken Burns, who's got this new documentary out, where he's quoting in succession, JFK, LBJ, Nixon, all of them during their terms in office, saying one thing to the American public publicly, and then getting captured on tape in all three cases saying something completely different, like, this is unwinnable, what am I doing,
right.
How do we get out of this? This was the opening of the credibility gap that, again, has salience today. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, one of the things that happened in Vietnam, and it kind of backfired for the military in this case, is that they gave journalists carte blanche. If you were a reporter and you had credentials in Vietnam and you could get on a military vehicle, you could go anywhere you wanted in the country and you could report from anywhere. And so as a result, these young correspondents like Gene would go out in the field and they'd be talking to the young American officers who were actually trying to implement this policy, which was coming from, and they were telling these reporters, this is not working, and here is why this is not working. And so, and they didn't really have a mechanism, these young officers, to confront General Westmoreland at a press conference in Saigon, but the reporters came back and began confronting it. They started calling the daily briefings the 5 o'clock follies, because it was a great show and it was generally false. So I think that was a big piece of what happened. I think that, to this day, there are still people who believe that the military was about to win the war in Vietnam, but the press, cut them off at the knees. And I would argue that it's true to some extent, but the reason that the press cut the military effort off at the knees was because they were telling the truth, as opposed to the military commanders and our political leaders who were lying about what was going on. And I think the American public sensed what was true at a certain point, and the tide of public opinion began to turn against the war. So if journalists are responsible for having told the truth, guilty as charged.
Well, and that is journalists' role, but is there an argument, and again, to play devil's advocate for a second, that the war could have been won if they had not told the truth?
I don't think so. But, and I'm not an expert on the war in Vietnam, and there are plenty of smart people who wouldn't agree with me, and maybe they're right and I'm wrong. But, it seemed to me that a minimum prerequisite for being able to have a democratic South Vietnamese government that would survive, you would have to have a democratic South Vietnamese government, which didn't exist. And perhaps in the early days an aspirational democracy, but by the time that President Hue was boasting of his 94% election victory for a second term, it had become a charade. And everybody knew in Washington and people in the military that it was a charade. So without an ally of any credibility, and I don't see how the United States, short of creating a puppet government in the South and propping it up indefinitely, I don't understand how that war could have been won. And the other thing I'll say is that, like it or not, and we did not like it, the Vietnamese people, North and South, were motivated by a powerful desire to be free of foreign influence, to be independent. And fairly early on in the 1950s, the Communist Party had wedded itself to that nationalist movement. So I really think that by the time the United States entered the war in the 1960s, they were fighting against a movement that was both communist but also nationalist. And I don't think that was a war that we could win.
And when you talked, 50 years after the fact to soldiers and commanders from Hue and Vietnam more generally, did they agree with that assessment? Or do they now agree with that assessment? And how do they feel about that, both at the time, if they felt that then, and how do they feel about it now?
Well, General Downs is here, General Mike Downs, who was a company commander
I was leading up to that.
in the book, and we should ask him. But what I find, and we will when we go to answer questions, Mike is going to answer questions too. As I asked everyone I interviewed, every American I interviewed, and Vietnamese, how do you feel about the war now? And I got as many different takes on it as there were people. I would say, I would characterize, one of the most common feelings was a tremendous sense of pride in having served and having done their duty. I think not all, but most of the Marines and soldiers I interviewed felt that. Most of them also felt betrayed. They felt betrayed by a number of things. Some of them felt betrayed by their own military commanders. Some felt betrayed by cowardly politicians. Some of them felt betrayed by the press. Some of them felt betrayed by the American people. And there's truth in all of those things. But there was, I think, a broad sense of betrayal. And I also think that there was an overwhelming sense of the tragedy and futility of that effort, which, for whatever reason you ascribe.
That they felt at the time, or only in retrospect?
Oh, I think a lot of guys started to feel that after they'd been there for a while. I think most Americans who served in Vietnam went with the highest of intentions and full of a desire to win, to prove themselves as soldiers, to do their part for the country. And I think for many of them, over the course of the year or 13 months that they served, that began to sour. They began to see that the war, as it had been sold to them, was not what they were seeing. And in large part, it had to do with the Vietnamese people, with their understanding of, the average Vietnamese civilian did not want American troops around, nor did they want Viet Cong around. They wanted to be left alone, for the most part. So there was tremendous hostility in many places toward American troops. Some of it based simply on a disgust with having these foreigners tromping around with guns, shooting them all over the place. And some of it from people who truly sided more with the communists as a nationalist movement. And then some of it was also to see the corruption of the South Vietnamese regime that we were supposed to be supporting. They didn't necessarily know the depths of corruption in Saigon, but they could see South Vietnamese military units where the commanders would run away, when the shooting started, or who had their jobs because they were related to somebody. They could see soldiers who had no real depth of commitment to the cause. And they often saw Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers who were as fiercely committed to the cause. I can't remember who it was who said this, but it probably was said by dozens of American officers at different times. If I had a company of troops like these Viet Cong guys that we captured, we would win this war in a matter of months, but that was not the case.
And this is going beyond the scope of your reporting on this book per se, but obviously you've written about more contemporary foreign policy challenges and military efforts. Do you see lessons from this book that can be applied to the prosecution of American foreign policy now in Afghanistan, Syria, anywhere else, or is that kind of beyond the scope of what you feel?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to offer my opinion. Again, not as someone who's a broad expert, but there are similarities between Vietnam and our predicament right now in Iraq and Afghanistan. And certainly it became true in Vietnam that we were looking for a way to get out, and I think we're kind of looking for a way of getting out right now in those two places.
Peace with honor, or victory.
It's not easy. I think that there is an alarming tendency. It was evident in Vietnam. It's been evident in Iraq, certainly, and throughout our history, of a kind of a way of dumbing down when we face the rest of the world. We see it going on right now with an understaffed State Department and with politicians who project their domestic political priorities on the rest of the world. So in the 1950s and 60s, it was this communist monolith was taking over the world. And so it was terribly important for the United States to, as Kennedy said, bear any burden, pay any price. And that was such a simplification of the reality of the world. If you actually look at what was going on in Vietnam, you had a far more complex situation. You had, as I said, a nationalist movement that embraced communism in the late 40s and 50s after the United States essentially turned its back on Ho Chi Minh, who was shopping for a sponsor, and he ended up finding one in Moscow. And I think that, when we entered the war in Vietnam, we did so with a misunderstanding of what was going on there. And also, I think, a deep underestimation of the little Asian people, that we were fighting against. There was a great deal of arrogance and racism involved. I think some of those kinds of things are still going on. I believe, and I wrote in the epilogue of the book, I respect people who approach our role in the world with humility, who recognize, as Ernie Cheatham did, that I don't really know the right thing to do necessarily. I need to listen. I place tremendous value in the Foreign Service. That's the part of our government that's responsible for making us smart about the world.
Wasn't it Rex Tillerson said, or no, it was General Mattis said, every time you cut the Foreign Service budget, I need more guns.
Exactly. I mean, that's what gets you into wars. I think that, the young people who go live overseas, who learn languages, who develop a deep understanding of places, need to be listened to. They're not always right, but it certainly would correct some of that dumbing down that often happens in our politics. And I think it would keep us out of a lot of trouble.
Well, I want to, in a moment, transition to talking to General Downs and then opening up for broader questions. But last question before we do, aside from General Downs, you interviewed so many people for this book. There are so many characters. Who are some, like the 3 or 5 who stand out most to you as the ones that stick with you?
Well, I mentioned Ernie Cheatham. I was fascinated by Che Ting Mung, who is the first character you meet in the book. She was an 18-year-old village girl who was living just outside of Hue. And she stood in my mind as a wonderful contrast to the 18-year-old American who is either drafted or enlisted and is sent to Vietnam, who doesn't even know where Vietnam is necessarily, who has no real understanding of the war that they're fighting. Che, who was, as I said, 18, her family had been fighting this war for generations. Her grandfather had fought with the Viet Minh. Her father had fought with the Viet Minh and been jailed. Her older sister fought with the Viet Cong and was killed. And when her sister was killed, Che, when she was just 16, was arrested and waterboarded and interrogated. And I met her when she's roughly my age, just a couple years older than me, and she's still proud to this day that she never gave up anything about her family or her friends in the village when she was waterboarded. I thought she was a really interesting character who gave me a deeper understanding of the depth of the movement. Che is not an ideological person, even to this day. She's an ophthalmologist now. She was moved by nationalism and love of her family. So she was fighting for all the right reasons, I think. And she was very courageous, I believe. So I found her really interesting. I'm going to just talk about the Vietnamese characters now, because there's another fascinating character in the book. His name is Nguyen Da Huan. And Huan was a Buddhist who, those of you who are familiar with the Vietnam War, the Buddhists had been kind of at war with the Saigon regime off and on through the early 1960s. And in one of those crackdowns, Huan had to go on the run, or he would have been arrested, and he ended up running away and joining the Viet Cong. And he was a poet and a writer, so he became a propagandist, and he also became a true believer in the Viet Cong cause. So he led one of the advance units into the citadel on the morning that they took the city back. And for him, this was a triumphant homecoming. He was coming back to his home. Found himself caught up in the purges, the executions. When the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong took Hue, remember, this was a civil war. And to the communist forces, those who were working for the Saigon regime or who were supportive of the Saigon regime were traitors. And so they had long lists of targets, of people to round up and arrest. Many of these people in the first days that they occupied the city were executed on the spot. Many others were marched off supposedly to re-education, who were never heard from again. Mass graves were later discovered. And Juan was fascinating to me because he was a very idealistic young man who got caught up in those purges, and to this day is shamed by his involvement in that. And there's an interview with him in the epilogue of the book where he says, this was wrong, what happened in Hue, and we need, as a country in Vietnam, to acknowledge that what we did was wrong. Even if it was only one person who was executed, we needed to acknowledge that that was wrong. And Vietnam is still an authoritarian country, and I'm sitting there with a deputy minister of information from Hanoi. So anyone who's being interviewed by me knows that they're also talking to the government of Hanoi. So for him to be that candid about how he felt and his own experience was quite remarkable, I felt. So he stood out in my mind as a kind of remarkable character. And the last one who appears again throughout the book is Nguyen Van Hoang, who later in life became the mayor of Hue. But during the Battle of Hue, he's a student leader who turns against the Saigon regime and the Americans. As soon as the big American forces began to arrive in 1965, it clarified for him that this was a struggle for the independence of his country. And he was key to smuggling weapons, and there's a funny chapter where he's given the task of smuggling weapons into Hue, and he's terrified and doesn't know what to do, and it's a good story. he was just a wonderful storyteller and a very charismatic guy. And so, on both of my trips to Vietnam, I went back to those people and made sure that I understood their story fully. So those are some of my favorites.
Good stuff. Well, let's turn now, as a way of opening Q&A to all of you. But General Downs.
Can we start by asking Mike Downs? Mike, do you want to just explain, for those who haven't read the book, what your role was? Did you want to come up here?
Come on up, actually.
Yeah. There's steps over here, so you don't have
And I would add to that, what was it like being on the ground, and what did Mark get right and wrong?
Well, I turned 28 in Way City, which will be 50 years ago come February, so you can sense how old I am now. I was a company commander. I had been a company commander from early October, so had been with Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines for some time when Way occurred. And I spent 31 years on active duty, retiring in 1992. One thing that I'd like to comment on, because it was a part of the conversation, was having to do with the press. And I can tell you that up until I read this book, I still had the long-held opinion that the press never got it right. And there's enough evidence here that the press was more right than a number of the military reports. And this went on throughout the career. I mean, whenever you were at a school, if the press came up, it was never a positive comment. So besides my learning about that particular element that was covered by Mark in his book, the other thing is, for all these years, my view is the view of a company commander. I didn't read a lot about Way, and I didn't know a whole lot what was going on 2 blocks from the right and the left. And certainly nothing of what was going on the other side of the city. I was in the south of the city. And so I learned a whole lot about what went on in Way, and I'm a much more informed individual today than I was prior to the writing and the participation I had with Mark in the writing of his book. And the last thing I would want to say up front is Mark Bowden's appreciation for then Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Cheatham is very well placed. He was our battalion commander. He was a huge person, having played defensive tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Colts for 1 year. He'd been traded during the course of the year.
He said he was traded for a sponge and a water bucket.
Yeah, and he decided that there wasn't a whole lot of money to be earned in the National Football League, and he rejoined the Marine Corps. He had already been an officer in the Marines, and he was trying to raise a family. But he was a huge presence in Way, and is directly responsible for all the successes that the Marines earned in the south of that city.
I have kind of, let's open up to more broadly, but I have kind of an absurd hypothetical for you, General, which is that if you knew then, in 1968, what you know now, having read Mark's book, would that have changed your thinking? I mean, you were going to do your job.
No, I don't think so. I mean, because we tried to make it a point to only pay attention to the things for which we were responsible. And our company had a lot to do. And that was our focus of responsibility, and I wasn't worried about what General Westmoreland didn't have any idea what he was doing.
But you weren't afraid to question your, I mean, you, as I recall from Mark's book, you were trying to take a prison, and you said, I can't do this. This is crazy. We can't even go 2 blocks.
Well, on our first day in the city, our company arrived on the 1st of February, and there was a little small enclave of American military and civilian officials in a building that was, I'm going to say 3 blocks from the McVie compound. And Golf Company, which is the company in our battalion that arrived first the day before, had tried to get there on the 1st of February and were not successful. And our company was given that role. Well, we didn't get a block, and took a lot of casualties, and our company got to that building on the 5th of February. So, the point the question to your question, when we came back, we were ordered at sundown to cease our assault, and we came back and occupied positions in a building right next to the MACV compound. And I was called to the battalion commander's position in MACV compound early evening. This was the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. Colonel Cheatham wasn't yet in the city. He didn't arrive until the 3rd. But I was given an order, or our company was given an order to go to the jail. And the jail was right behind province headquarters, and I was told that the only way to get in the jail was through province headquarters, the only way for us to get in. And it had something, the purpose was having something to do with the political prisoners. Well, I asked if anybody had informed province headquarters that we were coming, and was told there were 12.7 machine guns on the roof of province headquarters, enemy weapons, which tells you that province headquarters didn't belong to anybody of ours, and if that's how you had to get through. And you ask about the enemy disposition in the 6 blocks away, and the impression you got, and a true one, was that was occupied by the enemy. And so this was just crazy. And I asked the battalion commander if it would be permissible to, when he said it was the orders from Task Force X-Ray, I questioned whether Task Force X-Ray even knew what was going on. And I asked if it would be permissible to write a message to them and inform them. And I drafted a message with the help of a Marine major. To this day, I don't know his name. He was just sort of in the city. He was on sea duty on a carrier, and he found his way into the city just to see what was going on 30th January, and so he was there. In any case, the message tried to explain what, in fact, was going on, and to Lieutenant Colonel Gravel's credit, he sent the message. It was from him. It wasn't from me. It was from him, and within a few moments, the message came back canceling that attack. A little side note, I had radioed the gunnery sergeant. I didn't have an executive officer, and told him to have the platoon commanders at our company position ready to receive an order when I came back. And I called him again just as a message from Task Force X-Ray returned, and told him to stand down and let the platoon commanders go back to their platoons. And when I returned, the gunny said, by God, sir, I thought we were going to go back down that street we were on this afternoon. And I said, Gunny, if where we were going, we went where they were telling us to go tonight, it would make this afternoon look like a walk in the park.
You know, I just want to say, Mike would remember, we met each other, what, about 4 years ago now?
October of 2013.
Okay, so you're a good memory. I went to Mike's house, and the patience that he showed me, and I was so ignorant of this battle, was incredible. He had maps, and Mike has a little handwritten, he carries it around with
Yeah, I got, this is a casualty book of every Marine in our company killed or wounded by day. And that's when I wrote it down,
and
on
so,
that day.
And that proved to me to be invaluable to me, because in trying to keep track of the time sequence, just looking at the day that certain men were wounded or killed gave me a time reference that I could then use to more accurately construct it. So I'm indebted. And then when before the book was published, Mike graciously agreed to point out all of my mistakes and quarrel with me about all my characterizations, which I greatly appreciated. So, I mean,
But a lot of these
really
characterizations of mine were wrong, because they were based on my understanding and my knowledge and my experiences. And what Mark was talking about was things were things that went on at other places. And I quickly learned that you only can be definitive about those things for which you have personal knowledge and experience, not something you know nothing about.
Well, so there's microphones on either side here. Please keep your questions very brief for either Mark or General Downs. So right here on the right.
Wonderful talk. My question is, does your book resolve an ancient controversy as to the goals of launching the Tet Offensive? One theory is that the North hoped for a kind of 1968 version of Dien Bien Phu, an outright victory over Americans. And the other is that they knew it ultimately would fail, but it would change American public opinion irreversibly. Mm-hmm. So the other third view is that they hoped for a victory, but even changing American public opinion would in the long run count for a victory?
Well, it's a good question. And the answer is that all of those versions are true. And multiple things can be true at the same time. The propagandists in Hanoi, their justification for the Tet Offensive, and they call it a general offensive / general uprising, was that they believed that by launching these urban attacks, the population of South Vietnam would rise up in support of the revolution, and this would effectively end the war. They would defeat the Saigon regime, and the Americans would be forced to withdraw. There were plenty of more realistic folks within the party and within the political leadership and within the military, North Vietnam, including Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, who believed that this was a pipe dream, that the people were not going to rise up and that the war could not be won that easily. But they did their duty once the decision was made. And then I think some of the idea that this was launched knowing that it would fail, but that knowing it would have a powerful impact on American public opinion and also the South Vietnamese public opinion. Some of that is true, but a lot of that is hindsight. I do think there were individuals like Le Duan, who was the chairman of the party, who at one point said something along those lines, that even if we lose, this will have such a shocking effect. But I don't think that was an overriding theory. I think that is a theory that's sort of been applied in retrospect to make them seem a lot smarter than they actually were.
Over here on the left.
Hi, my name is Eric Villard from the Army Center of Military History, and I've been doing TET for a long time, so this is something, this talk, something I absolutely wanted to see. I look forward to reading your book. I have not had a chance, but I did want to ask you a question in advance of that. The Battle of Hue often has been told through the lens of the Marine experience, less so the Army experience, but what about the South Vietnamese experience? Right. Because in the Citadel, for most of the battle, it really was a South Vietnamese affair. And you have those South Vietnamese Marine battalions who fight a week in Saigon, then come up to the Citadel and fight for another 2 or 3 weeks. So just telling their story.
Well, first of all, Eric, I recognize you, and your research and writing is sourced in my book. I'm grateful to you, for the work that you've done. It was really helpful to my understanding of what went on. Yes, I do write about the South Vietnamese Army, General Truong up in the Mac Mang Ca compound inside the Citadel, and his troops. Harry Hue, who is probably the most famous of the South Vietnamese officers, his story is told in my book. I didn't write about the South Vietnamese Army to the extent that I would have liked to. And part of that is that it was really hard to find South Vietnamese officers. This is an army that was defeated and dispersed. And even here in the United States, where many of those veterans now live, they're reluctant still, because of family who still live in Vietnam, to speak out. Harry is an exception. Yeah. But I asked Harry repeatedly to put me in touch with some of his fellows, trying to get more of that side of the story, and he never was able to furnish one who was willing to talk to me. So it is actually a regret that I have that I wasn't able to do more. But I have read what's out there, and I did, speak to those who I could, and I've tried to tell as best I could. Certainly made the point that they were a major piece of the effort to take the city back.
You know, and this, and to that point, our battalion south of the city had no South Vietnamese forces with us. So it wasn't until well after the war that I had any idea what the South Vietnamese Army was doing. And I've met Colonel Way, who lives in Arlington, Virginia, and another character that Mark got in touch with is a friend of mine by the name of Jim Cooligan, who was a Marine advisor to Way's unit. And he was in MACV compound, not because that's where he was physically dutied, but because the Tet Offensive and the Tet holiday was on, and the military advisors generally left their unit so that the unit could enjoy their Tet holiday. So the South Vietnamese forces that fought, not unsurprisingly, were over on the Citadel side. I got into the Citadel for the first time in 1998.
Wow. Over here on the right, and I think we have, this is probably two more questions here. So over here and then over here.
Thank you. My name is Jean Nguyen. I'm with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I'm an American now, but I was born in Saigon in South Vietnam. My father was from the north, and we moved south in 1954. So I need to make some clarification about the war. And you have just said that you did not have much to say about the South Vietnam, especially the army, because you did not get in touch with them. And so I need to make a few points for the audience here and for all who follow us on the stream, and maybe who come back to this later as something on the record. First, I'd like to say that we thank all soldiers, Americans and all allied soldiers who have come and fought the war in Vietnam. It was a war against communism for freedom. And it was a war between the Vietnamese against communists. It is still going on. We appreciate all who have come and sacrificed your life in our country at that time. It was a noble war. You forever are remembered by us and in our heart. Secondly, I'd like to make a point that the Vietnamese nationalists were not the ones that you met that side with Viet Cong. My father was a true nationalist. He led the fight against the French, and then he joined the Viet Minh at the time, thinking that they were nationalists. But when he found out that the Viet Minh was actually communist, he left them, and he traveled south. So many of his friends who were nationalists were killed by the Viet Minh, by the Viet Cong, by the communists. So many of us, many nationalists were killed. Now the people traveled from the north to the south in 1954 after Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was fought by the nationalists of Vietnam, and many of us were killed then. And now we travel south and we start building the South Vietnam, a Republic of Vietnam. So you were right that the US came in and thinking that you were fighting the nationalists under communism, which was not true. There were many mistakes made by the leadership of the US, which to our dismay at the time, the Vietnamese people were very much trusting in our friends, because President Kennedy said, we would bear any burden, fight any foes. That never happened. So I, again, want to say that for all who read this book, I haven't read it yet, I will buy it, I will read it, but I need to make it clear that whatever is being brought to you from what this author said, he interviewed the witness in Vietnam now with the intelligence committee chief sitting behind the interviewers and the interviewees. So whatever is being told to him does not have any value. It does not reflect us, the Vietnamese. If you look back to what happened in Vietnam now, the whole Vietnam from north to south has risen up, has tried to fight against communism. If you read all the declassified materials, you understand that we actually had won the war in South Vietnam. And it was forgiven. It was given away because of the U.S. missed strategy. The fact was that at the time, you won out of Vietnam, which was true. But look at what we're dealing with now. It has been proven now that after the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, Russia and China, the international communists, continue to support the communists of the South and the North to take over Vietnam. And they continue to try to take over Southeast Asia now to this day in the South China Sea. And if you see what happened in North Korea and South Korea, and in North Vietnam and South Vietnam now, it's obvious that China would never let go of North Korea or North Vietnam or the whole Vietnam and the South China Sea and the Asia Pacific. I want to bring it back to what we look at today. And I want to say that what President Kennedy saw at the time, what President Eisenhower saw at the time was true. And what we need to see now,
Thank you for this.
I need to make this clear,
Well,
because
you give a chance
South
for them to
Vietnamese
respond.
have no time. We never were interviewed. Our voice never get heard. But I am today is an American, and it's on the national security of America that I need to raise this point.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I
need
do
to make it
appreciate- no,
clear.
you need to let me respond for a
Yes,
minute.
no,
As I mentioned,
I want
the
to
war
say-
in Vietnam was a civil war. And
No, it's not a
as-
civil war. Let me make
There were
one of my
many
points.
Vietnamese who agreed with what our speaker is saying.
Good. Ma'am, let him respond, please. Okay, quick question.
About the Hue massacre, when the children of Hue joined with the communists and turned around and killed their own parents, killed their own family. 6,000 civilians were killed and buried alive.
Yes.
That was when the whole...
Is this a question, though? What's the question to me?
That's the question of the meaning of the Battle of Hue.
Right.
Because that's what
So are you
exactly
asking me,
when
is that part of my story in the book?
inhuman and the genocidal of the communist regime. You don't touch about any of that.
That's actually not true, and as you said...
You haven't read the book,
You
ma'am.
haven't read the book, and if you read the book, you would see that it's written about extensively, and the figures about the thousands of people who were executed and purged is told in great detail. It's one of the lasting, shameful aspects of this episode. It is not ignored. Obviously, at that time and even today, there are many divisions of opinion in Vietnam itself about the history and about the way the country is being run today. And that's not surprising. I mean, it's a country of millions of people, many of whom, like yourself, very well educated, very strong in their convictions. My take on the history of the Battle of Hue is just that. It's my own. And I think if you were to write your book about the Battle of Hue, it would be a different story. And that doesn't surprise me.
Thank you. I agree with you in one point you said.
We need to give someone else an opportunity.
We have a gentleman over here who would like to ask
over
a
here.
question.
On stage, you
I just
said.
wanted to say, first of all, General Down, Semper Fi. Mr. Bowden, you wrote a great book. I really loved it. Now, here's the question I have, and it concerns leadership style and command style. I felt for a long time that the only insurgency war, that we ever fought successfully was the war in which we were the insurgents, our own war for independence. And in that war, George Washington had a style of leadership that was distinctly different than the British style. The British style, exemplified by Cornwallis in particular, who was his opponent toward the end of the war, was a top-down, command-directed style. Orders issued, carry them out. Washington's style was very different. He had large meetings with his officers, many of whom were lower level, and they talked about things, and he listened and listened and listened, and from that emerged his decision of what to do. Now, as you point out in your book, the Marine Corps, I was in the Marine Corps at the time, I was in Vietnam at the time, I wasn't at Hue, thankfully, but the Marine Corps style was very much the Lord Cornwallis style of directed top-down. In your interviews with the enemy, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong,
did you uncover any evidence that they used a style of command that was more like the Washington style, that they had larger meetings of people, maybe at company or battalion level, in which they solicited opinions, listened, and from that emerged a consensus as to what to do?
Yeah, I do believe that, and I can't really speak to the general policy of the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, but in terms of this battle, there were group meetings and discussions with field commanders of Viet Cong who had a lot of input in how they would proceed in taking Hue. In large measure because many of the troops that had infiltrated down from the north were complete newcomers to the region and certainly to the city of Hue, didn't know their way around. Someone like Che Thi Mung, the village girl, ended up leading troops into the city because they wouldn't have even been able to find their way in. And there's a wonderful scene in the book where one of the top military commanders is trying to tell one of the Viet Cong battalion commanders, where they're going to establish their headquarters and what they're going to do. And the battalion commander just basically tells him that he doesn't know what he's talking about, that's not, and he ends up appointing that man to be in charge of the assault on the city. So I do think probably by necessity, because the kind of communications lines that maybe would have been better for Americans, were not there always for the North Vietnamese, that they had to give individual units in the field a lot more leeway in decisions about how they were going to operate.
General Downs, do you have anything to add?
You may know that mission orders, as they came into vogue in the Marine Corps probably in the 80s, and it wasn't as dogmatic a style, and it left room for small unit leaders to have more flexibility. Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham was ahead of his time. He gave us mission orders in Hue, and his influence was as much by his presence on the battlefield as it was from any directives. The way the battle ensued, we didn't fight at night. We ended up making some night moves later on, but most of the fighting took place during the daytime, and the VC and NVA let it happen. Every night, Lieutenant Colonel Cheatham would have a battalion meeting, and we company commanders would find our ways back through streets that we'd been on during the course of the day, meeting on street corners with our radio operator, trying to wheel our way back there. Even in those meetings, unlike my experiences with the previous battalion commander, the company commanders sat up front, and his staff briefed him and his fellow commanders. And so we really felt like we had a role to play, and he listened to us and gave us the flexibility to respond to the specific circumstances we faced.
Well, thank you very much, General Downs. Thank you, Mark Bowden. Thanks to all of you for attending.
Folks, don't forget there is a book signing one level up in the Archives bookstore. We'll see you up there in just a few minutes.